My name is Laura Bennett, and I'm 38 years old. 10 years ago, my husband left me for my best friend on our wedding anniversary. He took the house. He took our savings. He took everything we'd built together, and she stood beside him while it happened. For a decade, I was the woman they destroyed. Then 3 weeks ago, they walked into my courtroom, desperate, broken, begging me to grant their divorce. The judge assigned to their case was the wife Benjamin had abandoned. And when Kimberly saw my name on the bench placard, she went so pale the bailiff had to bring her water. Before we go any further, I want you to know something. This story wasn't randomly generated. Every word, every emotional beat, every choice these characters make was crafted with intention by a real storyteller. There's a human heart behind what you're about to hear. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. The air in Courtroom 4B always smells of old paper, industrial lemon cleaner, and the heavy, invisible weight of failed promises. I thrive in this atmosphere. At 38, my life is a masterclass in precision. Every morning, I press my black silk robe, smooth my hair into a knot so tight it feels like a helmet, and take my seat upon the bench. I am the Honorable Laura Bennett, a name carved in wood and earned in blood. My pulse never quickens. My hands never shake. I have spent 10,000 hours studying the ways people tear each other apart, ensuring that when the gavel falls, it does so with the weight of absolute, unbiased law. My private life is a fortress of solitude and expensive linen. A world away from the girl who once begged a man not to change the locks on a house she paid for. The morning started like any other Tuesday. My clerk, Sarah, placed the daily docket on my mahogany desk at exactly 8:45. I sipped my black coffee, the heat grounding me, as I scanned the list of tragedies scheduled for the day. Domestic disputes, custody battles, and then, nestled between a property division and a child support modification, I saw the names, Peterson versus Peterson. For a second, the oxygen left the room. My mind didn't go to the law. It went to the smell of gardenias on my 5th anniversary. The day Benjamin told me he didn't love me anymore while Kimberly waited in his running car outside. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and felt the ice return to my veins. I am not that girl anymore. I am the law. The double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open at 9:02. I didn't look up immediately. I kept my eyes fixed on a motion for discovery, pretending to take notes. But I heard them. I heard Benjamin's heavy, confident stride, now slightly hesitated. A stumble in the rhythm I once knew by heart. I heard the frantic, light clicking of Kimberly's heels, a sound that used to signal a friend coming over with wine, but now sounded like nails on a coffin. The bailiff called the court to order, and I finally lifted my gaze. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Benjamin looked older, his golden boy hair thinning at the temples. His expensive suit hanging off shoulders that had begun to slouch under the weight of a decade of bad choices. Kimberly was a ghost of her former self. The vibrant, laughing woman who had been my maid of honor was replaced by a hollowed-out shell. Her skin was sallow, her eyes darting around the room with a frantic, rhythmic paranoia. When her eyes finally landed on me, sitting 6 feet above her, draped in the authority of the state, she didn't just gasp. She physically recoiled. She saw the placard, Hon. Laura Bennett. I watched the blood drain from her face in real time, leaving her a sickly shade of gray. Benjamin's mouth fell open, a pathetic, silent O of recognition. He looked at me, then at the bench, then back at me, searching for the broken woman he'd left in the rain. He didn't find her. In that moment, the courtroom felt like a nexus of 3 different lives. From my perspective, I saw 2 people who had gambled their souls on a betrayal and lost the payout. From Benjamin's perspective, I saw a man realizing that the crazy ex-wife he'd disparaged for years was now the only person who could legally dismantle his current life. And from Kimberly's, pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the bailiff, her chest heaving, her hands clawing at her throat, as if she were choking on the very air I commanded. The bailiff, sensing a medical emergency, stepped forward with a small paper cup of water, which she took with fingers that rattled against the rim. I remained perfectly still, a statue of professional indifference. "Counsel, please state your appearances for the record," I said. My voice was a calm, steady blade. It didn't crack. It didn't betray a hint of the history that lived in the marrow of my bones. Benjamin's lawyer, a sharp-faced man who clearly didn't know the history, stood up and spoke. Kimberly's lawyer followed. I looked directly at Benjamin and Kimberly, ignoring their lawyers for a brief, pointed second. Before we proceed, I continued, the court notes a prior personal acquaintance with both parties. Under the Code of Judicial Conduct, I am prepared to recuse myself if either party feels my impartiality is compromised. However, I am fully capable of presiding over this matter according to the letter of the law. I expected them to jump at the chance. I expected them to run from the room, terrified of the justice I might mete out. But then Benjamin looked at Kimberly, and Kimberly looked at the floor. They were broke. I could see it in the fraying cuffs of his shirt and the cheap synthetic blend of her dress. A new judge would mean months of delays, more legal fees they clearly couldn't afford, and a public record that was already starting to leak. They whispered frantically to their attorneys. Benjamin looked up at me, his eyes pleading, trying to find a spark of the old Lavra he could manipulate. We wish to proceed with you, Your Honor, he stammered. We trust your fairness. The irony was delicious, but I didn't let it show on my face. Very well, I said, the gavel resting beneath my hand like a sleeping predator. This is a court of law, not a theater for drama. We will adhere strictly to the California Family Code. Petitioner, you are seeking a contested dissolution of marriage with significant debt allocation. Respondent, you are contesting the alimony claims. I expect full transparency and absolute decorum. I set the tone with a sharpness that made Benjamin flinch. I wasn't just their judge. I was the architect of the next chapter of their misery, and I was going to build it with the very bricks they had used to stone me 10 years ago. I leaned forward, the shadows of the bench falling across my face. Kimberly was still shaking, her eyes fixed on my hands as I organized the case file. She remembered those hands. They had held her through her mother's funeral. Now, they held the power to strip her of everything she had stolen. I looked at the clock on the back wall, 9:15. We had only just begun, and already the air was thick with the scent of a decade-old rot, finally being exposed to the light. I felt a cold, clean peace settle over me. And that's when I realized this wouldn't be just another case. The first formal hearing began on a Tuesday that felt as sharp as a razor's edge. In a family court, there is a specific kind of silence that precedes a storm, a rustle of legal pads, the clicking of pens, and the heavy breathing of two people who once shared a bed and now share only a mutual hatred. Benjamin sat at the petitioner's table, attempting to adjust his posture to mimic the confidence he possessed a decade ago. Every few minutes, he would catch my eye and offer a small, mournful smile, a calculated tilt of the head that used to melt my heart. It was his old charm, a curated look of boyish regret. I met his gaze with the blank, impenetrable stare of a granite wall, my expression never wavering from the professional mask I had spent 10 years perfecting. Kimberly, on the other hand, was a study in fraying nerves. She sat as far from Benjamin as the table allowed, her shoulders hunched as if she expected the ceiling to collapse on her. Every time I spoke, every time I cited a statute or directed a clerk, she flinched. The lawyers, both seasoned veterans of the courthouse, began to sense the strange, high-voltage tension vibrating through the room. They looked between their clients and my bench, sensing a subtext they couldn't quite translate. Benjamin's attorney tried to play the angle of a man who had been led astray by circumstances, while Kimberly's counsel painted her as a victim of Benjamin's financial instability. They were already beginning to eat each other alive, right there in front of me. Your Honor, Kimberly's lawyer began, smoothing a silk tie that probably cost more than his client's current net worth. My client is under extreme emotional distress. Given the unique circumstances of this case, we request an expedited timeline. We are looking for a summary judgment on the division of assets to put this painful chapter behind everyone involved as quickly as possible. I watched Kimberly's hands. They were gripped so tightly around her purse that her knuckles were white. She wanted out. She wanted to run from the courtroom, away from my eyes, away from the living reminder of her greatest sin. She wanted a quick, quiet exit into the shadows where she could hide her shame. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. The court does not expedite for the sake of comfort, counselor, I replied. my voice echoing with a cold, deliberate authority. In fact, given the complexity of the debt declarations and the discrepancies in the initial filings, this court requires a far more granular level of documentation. I am ordering a full 3-year audit of all shared accounts, including any offshore or digital assets. I want every receipt, every transfer, and every gift exceeding $500 accounted for. I saw Benjamin's throat move as he swallowed hard. He knew what was in those files. He knew that a deep dive into his finances would reveal a pattern of behavior he'd hoped to keep buried. The following week, the war turned from the courtroom to my digital borders. At 11:42 on a Thursday night, a notification pinged on my private laptop. It was an email. The sender's name was Ben P., and the subject line was simply, "For old time's sake." My heart didn't skip a beat. Instead, it grew colder. I didn't open the body of the email. I knew exactly what it would be, a plea for mercy, a reminder of the love we once shared, perhaps even a pathetic attempt to blame Kimberly for everything that had happened 10 years ago. Benjamin always was a man who preferred to hide behind screens when his charm failed him in person. He thought I was still the girl who would keep his secrets to protect his reputation. I didn't hesitate for a single second. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the office of the presiding judge and the head of the ethics committee. I laid my laptop on the desk and showed them the unsolicited contact from a petitioner in an active case. I filed a formal report, ensuring that Benjamin's attempt at private manipulation was now a matter of permanent, official record. I requested that the communication be added to the case file as evidence of an attempt to influence a judicial officer. By noon, Benjamin's lawyer had been served with a reprimand that left him purple with rage. Benjamin had tried to play the man. I had answered as the judge. As the weeks dragged on, the gallery in courtroom 4B began to fill. Word had traveled through the local legal community and our old social circles. People I hadn't seen in years, people who had turned their backs on me when Benjamin and Kimberly became the it couple, started showing up to watch the spectacle. They sat in the back rows, whispering behind their hands, watching the fallen king and queen of our old world squirm under the light of my proceedings. I felt their eyes on me, searching for a sign of weakness or a hint of vindictive joy. I gave them nothing. I treated Benjamin and Kimberly with the same icy procedural distance I would give a stranger caught in a traffic violation. The tension reached a breaking point during a discovery hearing. We were discussing the liquidation of their remaining joint assets, the pathetic list compared to the empire we had once started to build. Kimberly's lawyer was arguing for a larger share of the remaining home equity, claiming Benjamin had wasted their savings on extracurricular activities. Benjamin stood up, defying his lawyer's frantic attempts to pull him down. "She's the one who wanted the lifestyle, Laura," he shouted, using my first name in a desperate, familiar outburst that silenced the room. "She's the one who pushed for the move, for the cars, for everything that drained us. You know how she is. You remember." The bailiff moved toward him immediately, but I held up a hand. The silence was absolute. I looked at Benjamin, not as a woman who had been betrayed, but as a predator looks at a wounded animal. "Mr. Peterson," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the very back of the room. "You will address this court as Your Honor. You will remain seated. And you will never, under any circumstances, assume what this court remembers or knows outside of the evidence presented in these 4 walls." I turned my gaze to the clerk. "Record a formal contempt warning for the petitioner." That's when the first document arrived that changed everything. The document that landed on my desk was a thick blue-backed folder containing the forensic accounting of the Peterson household from 2015 to 2018. As I flipped through the pages in the silence of my chambers, the sheer scale of the deception began to take shape. Benjamin hadn't just left me for Kimberly. He had systematically liquidated our joint retirement accounts and emptied my personal inheritance fund 6 months before he ever asked for a divorce. He had been funding their new life with the sweat of my brow while I was still making him breakfast every morning. The numbers on the page were cold, hard proof of a calculated heist masquerading as a midlife crisis. When we reconvened the following morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating. I ordered the specific exhibits regarding the 2015 transfers to be displayed on the digital monitors for the court to see. Benjamin's face went from pale to a mottled, sickly purple as his own signatures appeared on the screen dated months before our wedding anniversary. Kimberly stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open. She looked at Benjamin, then at the numbers, and I realized in that moment that she hadn't known the full extent of the theft either. He had told her it was his money. He had built their foundation on a lie that was now being dismantled in public. The proceedings took an even darker turn when Kimberly's own attorney entered a series of private text logs into the record. They were meant to prove Benjamin's volatile nature, to secure her a larger share of the remaining assets. But they served only to expose the rot of their union. "You're just like her," one of Benjamin's messages read, referring to me. "Always judging, always expecting more than I can give." Kimberly's replies were venomous, accusing him of never being over the wife he'd discarded. The perfect couple that had walked over my broken heart 10 years ago was revealed to be a pair of scorpions trapped in a bottle, stinging each other to death. By the third hour of the session, the lawyer representing Kimberly moved to introduce evidence of Benjamin's habitual infidelity during their own marriage. She produced a series of credit card statements showing hotel stays and jewelry purchases that didn't match Kimberly's collection. Benjamin's lawyer countered by producing a sworn affidavit from a former colleague of Kimberly's, alleging that she had been involved with a partner at her firm while Benjamin was struggling with his business failure. They were airing every piece of dirty laundry they owned, desperate to blame one another for the wreckage of their lives, while I sat above them, recording every shameful detail for the public record. I watched Benjamin as the testimony continued. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago, his expensive facade crumbling under the weight of his own history. He kept glancing at the gallery where several of our former mutual friends sat in stunned silence. These were the people who had toasted to their brave new love at their housewarming party a decade ago. Now those same friends were watching the truth emerge, that Benjamin was a thief and Kimberly was a paranoid wreck. The social standing they had sacrificed everything to build was evaporating in the sterile air of my courtroom. The most devastating blow came when the court called a surprise witness, our old neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He was a retired accountant who had lived next door to us during our marriage. He had been subpoenaed by Kimberly's team to testify about Benjamin's behavior during the initial split. He took the stand with a grim expression, refusing to look at Benjamin. "I saw them," he said, his voice shaky but clear. "I saw Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Peterson, then Miss Kimberly moving boxes into a van at 3 in the morning while Mrs. Bennett was away on a business trip. They were laughing. They were celebrating." The courtroom went deathly quiet. Kimberly lowered her head, her hair veiling her face as she began to sob, not with the elegant grief of a victim, but with the jagged, ugly sound of someone caught in a trap of their own making. Benjamin stared at the witness stand, his jaw working silently. The myth they had created, that their love was an unstoppable force of nature, that simply couldn't be helped, was being exposed as a sordid, late-night robbery. They hadn't fallen in love. They had conspired. And they had enjoyed the cruelty of it. I didn't offer Kimberly a tissue. I didn't offer Benjamin a reprieve. I sat there, my pen moving across my notepad with mechanical precision, capturing the testimony that would ensure this divorce was the most documented failure in the county's history. Every secret they had kept, every lie they had told to justify their betrayal, was being transformed into a legal fact. They had wanted a silent divorce, a quick erasure of their mistakes so they could start over once again. Instead, I was giving them a spotlight. I was making sure that the truth was so loud they would never be able to outrun it. As the clock struck 4, I called for a recess. The energy in the room was electric. The spectators whispering so loudly the bailiff had to call for order 3 times. I stood up, my robe billowing behind me like a shadow. I looked down at the 2 people who had once thought they could destroy me and leave me for dead. They looked back at me, and for the first time I saw that they finally understood. I wasn't just a judge. I was the personification of their past, coming to collect a debt that was 10 years overdue. But none of that prepared me for what I would hear next. The silence of my chambers during the recess allowed the ghosts of the past to finally speak. To understand the gravity of the documents on my desk, one has to understand that my divorce wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, methodical poisoning. As I stared at the wood grain of my desk, I remembered the months leading up to that final anniversary. It wasn't a lack of love that blinded me. It was the depth of my trust. Kimberly hadn't just been my best friend. She was my sister by choice. She was the one I called when Benjamin and I had our first fight about starting a family. I didn't know then that every doubt I confessed to her was being weaponized and whispered into my husband's ear during their secret lunches. Kimberly had played a long game, planting seeds of inadequacy in Benjamin's mind. She told him he was too vibrant for my serious nature, that my dedication to my law studies was a sign that I didn't value him. She played on his midlife insecurities, convincing him that he was losing his youth and that I was the anchor dragging him down. She didn't just want my husband. She wanted to see if she could dismantle the life I had built because she was envious of the stability I possessed. Benjamin, in his weakness, was an easy mark. He didn't have the character to resist the ego stroke she offered, and together they crafted a narrative where I was the villain of my own life. The day of our 10th anniversary is etched into my mind in high-definition horror. I had planned a surprise dinner at the restaurant where we had our first date. I left work early, carrying a bottle of vintage wine and a heart full of hope, thinking we were just going through a rough patch. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a moving truck tucked behind the garage. My first thought was that a neighbor was moving. My second thought, when I saw the front door wide open, was that we were being robbed. I ran inside, my heels clicking frantically on the hardwood floors, only to find the two people I loved most standing in the center of a half-empty living room. They weren't fighting. They were packing. Benjamin was holding our wedding album, his face a mask of cold indifference. Kimberly was standing by the fireplace, wrapping my grandmother's crystal vases in bubble wrap. The air in the house was stagnant, filled with the smell of cardboard and betrayal. "What is this?" I asked, the wine bottle slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. The red liquid pooled around my feet like blood, staining the rug we had picked out together in Italy. Benjamin didn't even look up. "We're leaving, Laura," he said, his voice flat. "We've already signed the lease on a new place. I filed the papers. The locks will be changed by 6 p.m. "We didn't mean for you to find out like this," Kimberly added, though her eyes sparkled with a triumphant cruelty that contradicted her words. She didn't look guilty. She looked satisfied. She was finally taking the lead role in a life she had only ever watched from the sidelines. They had been planning this for over 6 months. Every late night at the office, Benjamin claimed. Every weekend trip to see her parents. Kimberly took, it was all a coordinated effort to secure their new apartment and move our shared assets into accounts I couldn't touch. They had waited for our anniversary not out of coincidence, but as a final jagged insult to the decade I had given him. As I stood there in the wreckage of my home, my eyes landed on Kimberly's neck. She was wearing a delicate gold necklace with a sapphire pendant, the one I had lent her for a gala 3 months prior. It was an heirloom, passed down from my mother. When I saw it on her, the reality hit me with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just taking my husband. She was stripping me of my identity, piece by piece. She didn't even have the decency to take it off before facing me. It was a trophy. I realized then that their love was built entirely on what they could steal from me, not on what they could build together. "Get out," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Benjamin finally looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of the man I had married, a man who knew he was committing a moral atrocity. But then Kimberly touched his arm, a possessive, grounding gesture, and the flicker died. He turned back to the boxes, dismissing me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. They left 40 minutes later, the moving truck groaning under the weight of my furniture, my memories, and my future. I sat on the floor of that empty house for 12 hours, surrounded by the smell of spilled wine and shattered glass. That night, I didn't cry for Benjamin. I cried for the version of myself that had been naive enough to believe in loyalty. I realized that the legal system I was studying was the only thing that could ever truly protect me. I made a vow to the empty walls. I would never be the victim again. I would study the law until it was a part of my DNA. I would build a life so formidable that no one could ever pack it into a truck and drive it away. I spent that first night of my new life drafting a plan, not for revenge, but for a total, absolute reconstruction of Laura Bennett. The memory faded as the bailiff knocked on my door, announcing that the recess was over. I stood up, smoothed my robe, and checked my reflection. The woman who had sat on that floor was dead. The woman walking back into that courtroom was the one who held the gavel. I looked at the gold watch on my wrist, a gift to myself when I was sworn in as a judge. It was far more valuable than anything they had taken. I stepped back onto the bench, my eyes finding Kimberly's neck. The sapphire necklace was gone, replaced by a cheap, tarnished chain. But the memory of it burned in my mind. That necklace. I'll never forget that necklace. The transition from the floor of that empty house to the judge's bench was not a leap. It was a crawl through broken glass. After the divorce was finalized, I was left with exactly $3,200 and a car that stalled at every red light. Benjamin's legal team had been ruthless, exploiting every loophole to ensure I walked away with the bare minimum while he and Kimberly moved into a luxury condo downtown. I reached out to our mutual friends, the people we had hosted for dinners and holidays, looking for a shred of support. One by one, the doors closed. They chose the happy couple over the bitter ex-wife. I was social radiation, a reminder of a mess they didn't want to clean up. Survival became my only ambition. I took a job clerking for a small, dusty firm during the day and spent my nights working as a transcriptionist for a court reporting agency. For nearly 3 years, I slept 4 hours a night on a mattress I'd found at a thrift store. There was no room for grief because there was no time for it. Every cent I earned went toward my tuition and the pursuit of a law degree that felt like a distant mountain peak. I stopped eating out, stopped buying clothes, and stopped looking at social media. I vanished from the world Benjamin and Kimberly occupied, becoming a shadow that lived on caffeine and the sheer cold desire to never be that vulnerable again. In my second year of law school, I met Judge Harrison, a veteran of the family court system who saw something in my relentless, almost mechanical focus. He didn't offer me pity. He offered me a mountain of work. He became an unexpected mentor, pushing me to understand that the law isn't just about winning, it's about the surgical application of truth. Laura, he told me once, looking over his spectacles in a room filled with the scent of old tobacco and leather. Most people come into this court looking for a hug. Give them a mirror instead. If they don't like what they see, that's their burden, not yours. That became my mantra. The process of rebuilding wasn't heroic. It was a series of brutal, lonely victories. I remember the day I received my bar exam results. I was sitting in a laundromat, surrounded by the smell of cheap detergent, when I saw my name on the list of passing candidates. I didn't cheer. I didn't have anyone to call. I simply folded my damp towels, went back to my studio apartment, and started applying for positions in the district attorney's office. I worked 18-hour days, taking the cases no one else wanted, building a reputation for being the most prepared person in any room. I wasn't trying to be liked. I was trying to be undeniable. By the 5-year mark, the name Laura Bennett started to carry weight in the legal circles of the city. I moved from the DA's office to private practice, specializing in complex family law, and eventually, I set my sights on the judiciary. I wanted to be the person who held the gavel because I knew exactly what it felt like to be crushed by it. I spent 10 years building a life that was entirely my own, brick by excruciating brick. When I was finally appointed as a judge, my name appeared in the local paper. I wondered for a fleeting second if Benjamin or Kimberly saw it, but I realized it didn't matter. I hadn't done it for them. I had done it to survive them. My daily routine as a judge became my sanctuary. I loved the ritual of it, the way the courtroom silenced when I entered, the way the law provided a framework for even the most chaotic human emotions. I had reached a level of peace where I rarely thought about the anniversary or the moving truck. I had a beautiful home now, filled with furniture I had chosen for myself, and a career that defined me more than any marriage ever could. I had successfully edited them out of my narrative. They were a closed chapter, a faded scar that only ached when the weather turned cold. That sense of security made the shock of seeing them on my docket even more profound. When they walked into my courtroom 3 weeks ago, they didn't see the woman who had cried on the floor. They saw the Honorable Laura Bennett, a figure of absolute authority. I watched them through the lens of my 10-year journey, and I realized they hadn't changed at all. They were still the same small, selfish people, only now they were older and the world had started to treat them with the same indifference they had once shown me. They looked at the bench with hope, thinking perhaps my prior acquaintance would work in their favor. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires an emotional investment, and I had divested from them a long time ago. What I felt was a profound sense of justice, not the kind you see in movies with screaming matches and dramatic reveals, but the quiet, inevitable justice of time. They had stolen my past, but in doing so, they had forced me to build a future they could never touch. Now they were begging me to use the tools of my success to help them dismantle the very thing they had betrayed me to build. It was a circle so perfect, it felt scripted by fate itself. I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the documents for the afternoon session. Benjamin was staring at me, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to catch my eye. He looked like a man who had spent a decade running and had finally hit a dead end. Kimberly was staring at her own reflection in the polished wood of the table, perhaps seeing the same ghost I had seen in that laundry room years ago. I felt the weight of the gavel in my hand, cool and solid. They had no idea that I knew about the empty accounts and the secret messages. And now they sat before me, completely unaware of what I'd become. The evidence submitted over the next 3 days painted a harrowing portrait of the life Benjamin and Kimberly had built upon the ruins of mine. As the testimonies unfolded, it became clear that Benjamin hadn't just changed wives. He had simply found a new audience for his old patterns. A series of character witnesses, former neighbors, and a string of disgruntled business associates revealed that the golden couple had lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade warfare. Benjamin had continued his habit of financial irresponsibility, while Kimberly had devolved into a state of paralyzing paranoia. She lived in constant fear that if he could do it with her, he would eventually do it to her. Their home life, according to a former live-in housekeeper, was a cycle of explosive betrayals and hollow reconciliations. Kimberly had spent thousands on private investigators to tail Benjamin during his business trips, only to find him at local bars, drinking away the money intended for their mortgage. The records showed that the police had been called to their residence 4 times in the last 3 years for noise disturbances, a polite, legal term for the kind of screaming matches that leave bruises on the soul. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, bound together by the secret they shared and the mutual distrust that secret had birthed. The most tragic revelation came during the discussion of their failed attempts to start a family. Kimberly's medical records, subpoenaed by Benjamin's counsel to argue against certain alimony demands, showed years of expensive fertility treatments that ended in heartbreak. In the transcripts of their therapy sessions, Benjamin had blamed Kimberly's nervous disposition for their inability to conceive, while Kimberly accused Benjamin of being genetically cursed. They had turned their shared grief into a weapon, using the child they never had as a way to wound each other more deeply. It was a stark contrast to the life I'd envisioned with him, a life that, in hindsight, I had been spared. The social isolation they faced was the most telling. One by one, the people who had initially supported their scandalous romance testified to their gradual withdrawal. They weren't invited to weddings or holiday parties anymore, not because of what they had done to me, but because their presence had become too toxic to bear. They were the couple that everyone whispered about at the table, the ones who would inevitably start a fight before the main course was served. By stealing my life, they had inherited my seat at the table, but they had forgotten that a seat is worthless if no one wants to sit next to you. During a particularly grueling cross-examination, a former neighbor testified about a night when Kimberly had locked Benjamin out of the house in the middle of a winter storm. He had sat in his car in the driveway, much like he had done on my anniversary, but this time there was no one waiting for him with open arms. He was alone in the dark, watching the lights of his own house go out. The neighbor described the scene with a touch of pity that felt like a hot iron against my skin. These were the 2 people who had thought they were upgrading their lives. Instead, they had merely traded a foundation of glass for a foundation of quicksand. Then came the moment that truly tested my judicial composure. Both legal teams, desperate to find some leverage, attempted to call me as a character witness for the other side. Benjamin's lawyer argued that I could testify to his prior stability, while Kimberly's lawyer wanted me to confirm Benjamin's long-standing history of deception. It was a bold, desperate move that sent a murmur through the gallery. They wanted the woman they had destroyed to act as the tiebreaker in their current wreckage. They wanted me to step down from the bench and enter the mud with them, to validate one of them at the expense of the other. I denied both motions with a coldness that silenced the entire floor. "This court is not a repository for your personal history," I stated, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "The Honorable Laura Bennett does not exist as a character witness in this proceeding. I am the arbiter of the facts presented here, and the facts alone. Any further attempt to involve the court in your personal psychodrama will result in immediate sanctions for both counsels." I saw Benjamin's shoulders sag and Kimberly's eyes fill with a fresh wave of tears. They had hoped to use me as a bridge. I reminded them I was the cliff. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, dramatic shadows across the courtroom, I looked at the two of them. They were exhausted, drained by the effort of trying to convince the world and themselves that they weren't the villains of their own story. They had spent 10 years trying to justify a single moment of cruelty, and in the process, they had forgotten how to be anything else. Their marriage hadn't been a romance. It had been a decade-long defense strategy that was finally failing. The life they had stolen from me hadn't brought them happiness. It had brought them a front-row seat to each other's worst impulses. I adjourned the session for the day, the sound of the gavel echoing like a final heartbeat. As I gathered my notes, I watched them exit the courtroom through separate doors. They didn't look back at each other. They didn't look at me. They walked out into the hallway where the public waited with their phones and their judgments. I realized then that I didn't need to punish them. The life they had lived for the last 10 years was a far more creative punishment than anything I could have devised. The life they stole from me had become their prison. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over during the cross-examination of the forensic accountant. Kimberly was on the stand, her hands trembling so violently that the microphone picked up the rhythmic tapping of her ring against the wood. As the attorney presented a series of wire transfers Benjamin had made to an undisclosed account in the Cayman Islands, money Kimberly hadn't known existed, her composure shattered. She didn't scream. She simply stopped breathing for a moment, her eyes rolling back as a full-scale panic attack took hold. The court went into an immediate uproar. I stood up, my voice cutting through the chaos to order a 15-minute recesso while the bailiff assisted her. Even in the quiet of the recesso, the walls of the courtroom felt thin. I remained on the bench, maintaining my posture when Benjamin did the unthinkable. Seeing the bailiff momentarily distracted by Kimberly's medical needs, he stepped toward the bench. "Laura," he hissed, his voice desperate and thick with a decade of unearned familiarity. "You have to listen to me. She's the one who handled the books. She manipulated me too. She made me believe you were going to take everything." I didn't even look down at him. I kept my eyes on the clock. "You're out of order, Mr. Peterson. Return to your seat and address me only through your counsel, or I will have you removed from this building." The coldness in my voice seemed to physically push him back. He retreated to his table, looking like a man who had finally realized the bridge he was trying to cross had been burned years ago. When the session resumed, both sets of lawyers requested a sidebar. They were terrified. The evidence was becoming so damning for both parties' tax evasion, fraudulent transfers, and mutual harassment that they were begging for a sealed settlement. They wanted to hide the wreckage. I looked at the mountain of public records we had already created and denied the request. The light of day is the best disinfectant, counselors. We proceed on the record. The final session was reserved for closing statements, a chance for both parties to address the court one last time. Benjamin went first. He stood and tried to deliver a prepared speech about human frailty and the complexity of the heart. It was a vague, pathetic attempt at a public apology, aimed more at the gallery than at the law. He spoke of his regrets, but he never looked at me when he said the word. He was still trying to be the hero of a tragedy instead of the villain of a betrayal. I watched his performance with the detached interest of a surgeon examining a tumor. Then Kimberly stood. She didn't use a script. She looked directly at the empty space beside the witness stand, her voice small and cracked. "I destroyed the best friendship I ever had for a man who never really loved me," she whispered. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the air conditioning hum. I thought if I took what Laura had, I would feel the way she looked safe, loved, whole. But all I did was inherit her ghost. I spent 10 years waiting for him to do to me what he did to her. And I was right to wait. It was the first honest thing she had said in a decade. Benjamin let out a sharp, derisive laugh, but it was quickly silenced by a look from the bailiff. The weight of her admission hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was admitting to a life of hollow victory. She looked up at me, searching for some sign of the friend she had betrayed. She found only the judge. My face remained an unreadable mask of judicial indifference. "This court acknowledges your statements, Mrs. Peterson," I said, my voice flat and final. "Counsel, are there any further motions before I move to my decision?" The lawyers shook their heads. They knew the game was over. The gallery was leaning forward, some people holding their breath. This was the moment they had all come to see, the final collision of a 10-year-old crime and a present-day judgment. I felt the eyes of every person in that room on me, waiting for a crack in my professional armor, waiting for me to finally scream or cry or gloat. I felt the weight of my life, the lonely nights, the 18-hour workdays, the $3,000 that became a career. I was the only person in the room who wasn't shaking. I stood up to retire to my chambers to finalize the written decree. As I turned to leave, I caught Benjamin's eye one last time. For a split second, the mask of the judge slipped, and I let him see the woman who had stood in that empty house 10 years ago. I didn't show him anger, I showed him pity. It was the most devastating thing I could have given him. He looked away first, his head dropping into his hands. He knew then that he hadn't just lost a wife or a fortune. He had lost the power to ever affect me again. I walked through the door to my chambers and closed it softly behind me. The silence was absolute. I sat at my desk and opened the file one last time. The law was clear, the numbers were tallied, and the truth was documented. I picked up my pen, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. There would be no fireworks, no dramatic music, and no emotional outburst. There would only be the cold, clean finality of a signature. I looked at the clock. It was time. And then it was time for my verdict. The courtroom was packed to capacity when I returned to the bench at precisely 4 o'clock. The air felt charged, as if a storm were about to break within the 4 walls of the chamber. I adjusted my robe and opened the leather-bound folder containing my final decree. I did not look at Benjamin or Kimberly as I began to read. My voice was steady, resonant, and devoid of any personal inflection. I spoke with the authority of the state, detailing the equitable distribution of their remaining assets. It was a meticulous 50-50 split of their debts and what little remained of their equity, exactly as the law prescribed for a marriage of their duration and financial history. However, the sting was not in the division of property, but in the findings of fact that preceded it. "This court finds," I read, my words echoing in the absolute silence, "that both parties entered into this union through a foundation of mutual deception and financial misconduct." I went on to cite the specific dates of the fund transfers from 10 years ago, effectively making the theft from my own accounts a permanent, undeniable part of their public record. I noted every hidden account and every fraudulent statement they had submitted during the discovery phase. By the time I finished the 3rd page, their reputations were not just tarnished, they were systematically dismantled. I then moved to the specific orders of the court. Given the documented history of mutual harassment and emotional volatility, I continued, "This court orders that both the petitioner and the respondent undergo mandatory individual psychological evaluation and 6 months of certified therapy before entering into any future legal domestic partnerships." A gasp rippled through the gallery. It was a rare move, reserved for the most toxic of cases, and it signaled to everyone in the room that I viewed their relationship not as a failed romance, but as a public health hazard. I was labeling them as unfit for the very institution they had desecrated. The financial blow followed. While the split was 50-50, I ordered that all legal fees and the costs of the forensic audits, which ran into the tens of thousands, be paid exclusively from Benjamin's portion of the remaining assets, due to his documented attempts to hide funds in offshore accounts. I saw his jaw drop as he realized that the half he was getting would barely cover the cost of the experts who had exposed him. Kimberly didn't fare much better. Her share was heavily garnished to settle back taxes that had been neglected during their years of living beyond their means. They were being granted their divorce, but they were being sent into the world with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weight of their own history. "Furthermore," I said, leaning forward to ensure my voice reached them without the aid of the microphone, "this court orders that all documents, Testimonies and financial disclosures from these proceedings remain unsealed. In the interest of public transparency and the integrity of the judicial process, this record shall remain open. This was the final nail. They had banked on a quiet disappearance. Instead, I was giving their story to the world. Anyone who ever Googled their names for a job, a loan, or a new relationship would find the detailed roadmap of their betrayal and their subsequent failure. I looked at Kimberly. She was staring at the table, her eyes red and swollen. She looked like a woman who had finally reached the end of a very long, very dark tunnel, only to find a brick wall. Then I looked at Benjamin. He was looking at me, his face a mask of disbelief and growing rage. He had expected me to be emotional, to perhaps give him a break out of some lingering, hidden affection. He hadn't prepared for the cold mathematical fairness of a judge who no longer remembered him as a man, but as a case file. He tried to stand, his mouth opening to protest, but the bailiff's hand was already on his shoulder. The marriage of Benjamin Peterson and Kimberly Peterson is hereby dissolved, I stated, the word dissolved sounding like the strike of a bell. I picked up the gavel. This was the moment I had envisioned in 1,000 different ways during my years of exile. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph, a rush of adrenaline. But as I looked at them, I felt only a profound sense of finality. The debt was settled. Not because I had taken revenge, but because I had allowed the truth to do the work I was too busy to do myself. I brought the gavel down once. Crack. The sound was sharp, final, and absolute. Court is adjourned, I said. I stood up, my movements fluid and practiced. I didn't wait for the bailiff to announce my exit. I didn't look back to see their reactions. I kept my eyes fixed on the door behind the bench, the one that led back to my life, a life that was no longer defined by what they had taken, but by what I had built. Benjamin made a sound, a strangled lavra, but I was already turning away. As I gathered my files in the quiet of the hallway, I felt something I hadn't felt in 10 years. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't joy. It was lightness. It was the feeling of a heavy rusted chain finally falling away from my ankles. I could breathe the air of the hallway without the scent of their rot clinging to it. I was no longer the woman they destroyed. I was the woman who had presided over their end. As I gathered my files, I felt something I hadn't in 10 years. I felt entirely, perfectly alone, and for the first time I loved it. The courtroom cleared slowly, a retreating tide of hushed whispers and shuffling feet. I remained at the bench for a few moments longer than usual, watching the heavy oak doors swing shut behind the last of the spectators. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the morning. It was clean, like the air after a fever has finally broken. Benjamin and Kimberly were gone. They had walked out of those doors separately, heading toward different lives that would forever be shadowed by the public record I had just finished writing. They left behind only the faint, lingering scent of Kimberly's perfume and the discarded tissues on the petitioner's table. I looked down at the empty chairs where they had sat for weeks. 10 years ago, those two people were the center of my universe, the twin suns around which my entire identity revolved. I had allowed their betrayal to define my worth for longer than I cared to admit. But as I sat in the stillness of Courtroom 4B, I realized that the woman they had wounded no longer existed. She had been replaced, layer by layer, by the Honorable Laura Bennett. The pain they had caused hadn't destroyed me. It had acted as a kill, hardening my resolve until I was as unbreakable as the marble pillars supporting the courthouse roof. Sarah, my clerk, approached the bench with a stack of final orders for my signature. She looked at me with a quiet, knowing respect. She had seen the way my hands never shook, the way my voice never faltered. "Are you all right, Your Honor?" she asked softly, her voice echoing in the hollow space. I looked at her, then back at the empty courtroom. "Yes, Sarah," I replied, my voice firm and clear. "In fact, I don't think I've ever been better." I took my pen and signed the final decree of dissolution with a single, elegant stroke. It was the last time I would ever have to write the name Peterson. I stood up and retreated to my chambers to disrobe. I hung my black silk robe on its hook with practiced precision. It is a heavy garment, both literally and figuratively, but today it felt lighter than air. I traded the uniform of the state for my own charcoal wool coat, smoothing the lapels in the mirror. My reflection showed a woman of 38 who had seen the worst of human nature, and had come out the other side with her integrity intact. The lines around my eyes weren't marks of age. They were the maps of a long, hard-won victory. I looked at my name on the door, Honorable Laura Bennett, and felt a surge of quiet internal pride. I gathered my personal briefcase, ensuring every file was in its proper place. I have always found comfort in order in the way a well-organized life can withstand the most chaotic of storms. I turned off the lights in my office, watching the shadows stretch across the law books that lined the walls. Those books had been my only companions during the lean years, and they had never betrayed me. I stepped out into the hallway, the sound of my heels on the polished stone floor a rhythmic, confident cadence. The courthouse was mostly empty now, the evening sun casting long, golden bars of light across the corridor. As I walked toward the main exit, I passed the bailiff, who was locking up the heavy bronze doors. He tipped his hat to me. "Have a good evening, Judge Bennett," he said. "You too, Miller," I replied, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city was humming with its usual frantic energy cars honking. People rushing to dinner, the world moving forward without a care for the dramas that had unfolded inside the stone walls behind me. I stood on the top step for a moment, breathing in the scent of the coming rain. I thought about the 21-day challenge I had recently finished for my own growth, and how the discipline of those days had prepared me for this very moment. 10 years ago, Benjamin and Kimberly had left me with nothing but a shattered heart and a stained rug. They had expected me to fade away, to become a cautionary tale of a woman who couldn't keep her husband. Instead, I had used the vacuum they left behind to create a space for something far more significant. I hadn't just survived. I had ascended. I had taken the wreckage of their cruelty and forged it into a life of purpose and power. I walked down the steps, my head held high, my gaze fixed on the horizon. I didn't look back at the courthouse, and I certainly didn't look back at the past. My car was waiting in its reserved spot, a symbol of the independence I had fought so hard to secure. As I unlocked the door, I felt a deep, resonant sense of peace. The narrative was finally complete. The story that had begun with a betrayal on an anniversary had ended with a verdict in a courtroom. I was the author of the final chapter, and I had written it with absolute, unwavering truth. I pulled out of the parking lot and joined the flow of traffic, the city lights reflecting in my rearview mirror. 10 years ago, they left me with nothing. Today, I walked out with everything that matters: my name, my work, and my peace. I turned on the radio, a soft cinematic melody filling the car, and drove toward the home I had built for myself. The door was closed behind me, the case was settled. And for the first time in a decade, the future was entirely, beautifully mine. Thank you for staying until the end. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe where every word is crafted with intention. See you in the next one.